There is a book ban brewing in Utah, and just to come out and tell you the two different sides to this issue, on the right, especially the far right, you have people who believe that books are being used to groom kids into becoming trans or homosexual. On the left, you have people who want to protect books and not have them banned at all. Just the term book ban kind of makes my skin crawl, because I don't think books should be banned. I think there should be age-appropriate books. Certain books are certainly not appropriate for younger kids, but why can't we just do that? So in our series of conversations, we're going to be talking about that issue. The first guest I want to introduce is Rebekah Cummings. She is running with Brian King to be lieutenant governor on the Democratic Party ticket. This is our interview.
All right. Welcome to Utah Stories. So today we have a very awesome guest. With us today is Rebekah Cummings. She is the Director of Digital Matters at the Marriott Library and candidate for Lieutenant Governor for the state of Utah. Thanks for coming, Rebekah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, this is such a huge, massive topic. We're talking about the banning of books and how Utah's gotten national coverage because our ban, of course, has to be more extensive and bigger than anybody else's ban. And at first, when this came up, I thought, and I just think this way because I try to be very independent. I thought this is the New York Times and the national media wanting to spotlight these weirdo conservatives who actually just want to protect their kids. But it's a lot more than that. Can you kind of explain how it's just gotten to be really kind of out of control and it's not just about protecting kids?
Sure. And I'm glad that you used that phrase, because I think something we can all agree on is that we all want to protect kids. I have not heard a single voice in this discussion that doesn't have deep concern for making sure our kids are okay. Sometimes we define that a little bit differently, though. I think for people who are more on the conservative end of the book banning battle, which I even know that phrase is contentious, they look at some of these books and say, these are stories I don't want my kids to have access to. And actually, librarians would support that. We think parents should have a say in what their kids should and shouldn't read. But for a lot of librarians and parents, actually, I have 3 kids as well, we know that some books are actually really important for kids and in some cases life-saving for kids. And some of those are the actual books that are being banned. Books that show depictions of sexual assault, for example, and give kids language around things that they may or may not have experienced. LGBTQ books, often for some kids, it's the only place where they can see themselves in a story and know that they're not alone in the world and that they're not strange, and they feel a connection. And we hear this from our LGBTQ youth all the time, that school doesn't always feel safe for them, but for 90% of LGBTQ kids, the safest place they feel is in the library. And so as librarians, when we see those stories taken away or banned, we actually feel like kids aren't being protected in a very different way.
Yeah, and I think, so to push back on that a little bit on the conservative side, there's a lot of people who are heavily conservative that believe schools are turning into institutions to groom kids, and that if they have proclivities toward LGBTQ, that a school and a teacher or a librarian might be the perfect one to sort of, get them convinced that they're trans or that they're gay or something like that. Can you explain how that's not the case?
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, having worked, and spent a lot of time in and around schools, no one is trying to turn anyone trans. I feel like that's a talking point that you hear sometimes that's meant to kind of inflame this conversation. Books are reflecting what we're already seeing. There are kids who are gay. There are kids who are trans. And these are not big parts of collections, by the way. I mean, in most schools, we're probably talking about categories that are less than 5% of the general collection. But it's the books that they tend to focus on the most, right? Because they don't want to see these stories in the schools. They want their kids, they think that if those books don't exist, then their kids won't be gay or won't be trans. And it comes from this place of fear. And I think sexual assault is another great example. If they don't want their kids to know that is a thing that exists in the world. But we know that knowledge can be very powerful for kids. And that, for example, 1 in 5 girls under the age of 18 have experienced some kind of sexual assault in Utah. And the books didn't create these stories. The books, again, are merely reflecting the things that already exist in the world.
Yeah, that's a good point. Back to that other broader issue, and not to beat a dead horse, but it's like, as a parent of a 7-year-old girl, the thing that I'm most concerned about is sort of the hypersexuality of our culture. Like, I think kids are getting sexualized at a young age. That's what I don't want for her. And so my big question regarding this whole debate, where the two sides are really essentially talking past each other, is why don't we just have parental consent forms and put these books into special behind a cabinet, or you have to have a parental signature to check these out? Why not? Or even like, you walk in a section, maybe the kid wants the book, but they got to get their parent's signature. They could just text their parents, hey, could I have this book? The parent says, yes, fine. Why not do something like that and make both sides happy?
Well, and I will say that would not make both sides happy.
I guess maybe not. Probably not.
I mean, I have an 8-year-old daughter, so I certainly understand.
Yeah, my daughter's 7.
Yeah.
So,
and she just started 3rd grade. I have a 6-year-old in 1st grade. And I can't be more clear about this. Not every book belongs in every library. Sometimes I think there are people who are, they want to like side with librarians, right? And they're like, no book should be banned. But then we have to define our terms, right? I mean, it's, okay, no book should be banned, but that doesn't mean every book belongs in every library.
Mm-hmm.
Librarians are trained in selecting books. I mean, that's part of our collection development. We have policies around what books are chosen. You won't find any of the quote unquote those books in an elementary school library. I mean, the ones that tend to be on the most basic.
So like the one I saw in the Utah list that was most pervasive was we said her name, Sarah Moss. Yeah. So she is a really popular author. Yes. A lot of people love her works. I mean, she just is really authentic in her prose, I guess, and in her content. But she does depict sex scenes with, pretty young girls and boys. And I saw some of these little snippets pointed out when we were talking about the show. Should those books be in public school libraries?
Great question. So I have not read the Sarah J. Maas books, full disclosure. I know a lot of people who love them. Romantasy as a genre is sort of on the rise. People, they love escape, and her books have a form of escapism. And I can certainly appreciate that. My understanding of Sarah J. Maas's books is that they started off for more of a young adult audience. So maybe like the first book might be appropriate in a high school library. And then as the books go on, they get increasingly sexier. Increasingly, again, I think we might talk about what pornography actually is. And I will say there is no book in any school library that rises to the level of pornography, but they get sexier, right, as the books go on. I think a well-intentioned librarian might look at those books and say, this does not belong in a high school library. And I actually have friends who, we go through reconsideration processes, or what we call them, when someone brings a challenge to us. Ideally, you have a committee of people that look at the book as a whole, which is critical. You can't just take a paragraph out of a book and understand that.
Yeah.
And so they might look at the book as a whole and say, there's a high demand for these books. Our students love them. They get them reading, but they may not belong here. And they can certainly get...
Why couldn't that book get like parental consent? I mean, I think it's cool that it's up to the librarian of individual schools, but couldn't, if it's, in a conservative district or whatever neighborhood and they want to ban it, why not just make that concession, say, okay, we're going to have these books, but the parent has to give permission? Sure.
It's a great question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is it does create a little bit of an administrative and logistical barrier, right? Which books get put behind? That is a real concern for me, because historically when we've had these conversations, it's a lot of LGBTQ books that end up being hidden. It stigmatizes kids and says, not that their identity isn't appropriate to be on a shelf, even when there's no sexual content at all in the book. I think that's a real problem. When you work in a library too, you understand you're serving diverse communities with lots of different opinions. What's appropriate for one family is not appropriate for another family. I mean, I have a 19-year-old son as well, so that's the upper end of my ages. And when he was a senior in high school last year, there is not a book in his high school that I would have not wanted him to read. Honestly, at this point, I just want any of my teenagers reading as much as they can.
Mhm.
I mean, these kids have cell phones in their pockets.
Mhm.
They have 24/7 access 24/7 access a day to some of the worst things that anyone can access. And I promise you, the literature that they are exposed to, quote unquote, in their school libraries as parents should be the absolute least of our concerns.
Yeah.
And I again do say that knowing not every book belongs in every library, that sometimes, very rarely, librarians get it wrong. I mean, now that we've been put under a microscope, we actually know how frequently we get it right. The challenge rate is like 0.0005% of our collections. Oftentimes, we are spending hundreds of hours and tens of thousands of dollars on these challenges to remove 5 books from a library, which even if you don't care about protecting books or intellectual freedom, that is such a tremendous waste of time and resources.
I totally agree. Absolutely.
Be helping kids learn how to read and fostering a love of reading,
Yeah.
not spending all their time wondering if this sexy fairy book goes a little bit too far.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought up the phone thing, because I absolutely agree. We are wasting so much time and energy on this topic, and it's become such a hot button topic. And my question is, like, why are the phones not a bigger topic? We know teenage suicide has gone through the roof. Yes. We know that that suicide ideation and just the idea that, I'm not good enough is just because of social media and phones has gone through and I think a lot of parents don't know these statistics, that getting on social media is so mentally damaging for your children, and to compare your life with other kids' lives is so awful. And then to be able to have access to porn, real porn, 24/7 at any point in time, and that's not a bigger issue than this.
It's a much bigger issue. I mean, you're absolutely just so spot on with that. And again, as a parent, I think about this stuff all the time, that people have access to our kids all the time through digital means. We are far too worried about, I'm going to pause for a second, because I actually do think the concerns that parents have who bring these book challenges forward, I connect with those, because I also spend a lot of time worrying about my kids. I think it's misplaced, though. I think that there's all these concerns about information that kids can get, but it's a lot easier to go to your school library and lodge a complaint with a real person and be able to take real action than to spin over, Instagram and TikTok and Discord and YouTube and Snapchat and all the things we feel like we have far less control over.
Yeah, but as a parent, I just think you should be putting your energy into getting that phone out of that kid's hand, and getting good content in front of your child, because I just see our kids were 4 and 6 when they were first exposed to horrible crap from other kids' phones. They don't have phones, but the other kids were bringing this crap, and they were having nightmares over what they were seeing over the other kids' phones. And I'm like, how do you stop that? I mean, there should be something done about that. Yeah. And all that thought, power, and energy should be going toward that.
Right. Let's put our collective energy into phone-free schools I think would go a long way towards helping kids learn when they're there for the day, and that would help teachers actually help keep kids focused. A lot of our school districts have already gone phone-free. But there was a great book I read this year, Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That one.
I haven't read it, but I've seen him on podcasts. Yeah. Love that guy.
Just, it validated what so much of us feels like is true, that our kids can't learn when they have the most distracting device in the history of mankind sitting in their pockets. And it kind of takes collective action, because when your kid is the only junior higher that doesn't have one, then it makes them feel like they need to have it. And then they put that pressure on their parents. Obviously, it's our job to hold the line as parents. And by the way, if a parent says to a kid, I don't want you reading this book, we want them to be a part of that conversation. We want them talking to them about what their kids are reading.
Is that the case for all librarians? Can you speak for all librarians when you say that?
Sure. I mean, I think that...
Or most librarians.
In our ethical code that, we work with parents and their kids, that parents have a right to say what their kids can and can't read, but not a right to say what other kids can and can't read. Again, like I met with a really well-intentioned legislator at one point, and he said, why don't we just take a Sharpie and black out the words or the passages that people disagree with?
Redact it, yeah.
Well, to his credit, he was trying to think creatively. What can we do to keep the book, but maybe not the parts people don't like? And I pushed back and said, but I want my son to read those words. I want him to read what the author intended, and why does he get to pick what words my son gets to?
Yeah, and so let's touch on the ridiculousness of some of these books that have been banned, and I'm just blown away. I didn't know this. We have a bookstore owner coming in later on in the day, who has a whole banned book section, and I could not believe what was in that section. Green Eggs and Ham was banned. Is that part of the
farting dog was banned,
and something like a kid's adventure, underwear adventure.
Oh, was it Captain Under?
Are you kidding me? And it's like that has nothing in it even remotely risque.
No,
he just happens to be Captain Underpants. Yeah. And then we got like The Catcher in the Rye. I read that my junior year in high school. So is that statewide? You can't check that out from public libraries?
Those books are not banned statewide. Those books have been banned in individual schools and individual districts. And there's even, I think, more egregious examples. I mean, we listed it kind of
To Kill a Mockingbird, right?
Kill a Mockingbird. One that sticks out in my mind, this is all also kind of part and parcel of a larger moral panic we're seeing, and we've been seeing since 2020. It kind of started with these parents' rights groups were meeting around mask mandates and CRT and DEI and social and emotional learning. I mean, library books kind of got swept up in that. But one example that sticks out in my mind when CRT became a thing that was criticized is that Ruby Bridges Goes to School was banned in certain states in the South. That is literally just the story of a little girl breaking race barriers when schools were integrated. But they were calling that book critical race theory and demanded it be taken out of their schools. And this is where we get into really murky territory when we allow one parent to say what's acceptable for everyone else in the district. And we have the data that shows it's actually very few parents bringing these challenges forward. In the Alpine School District, I think it was Alpine, this was KUER reported on this, but 199 out of the 204 challenges came from one couple. The Washington Post did a meta-analysis of these book challenges and found that it was 11 parents that were responsible for the vast majority of the challenges. So we really can't allow the most conservative voices to dictate what all the rest of us have access to. And as librarians, it is easy to point to some of the tougher books. Genderqueer is the example that a lot of people use, that also it's a graphic novel. So should images be treated differently than depictions? I think that's a worthy question for discussion.
And so back to that, I think that the state legislature in Utah, and we did a story 12 years ago, how a public library had life drawings, nudes, and a bunch of people got together and said, this is porn, and that's not porn, and neither is a depiction of a sex scene. Obviously, it might be considered risque, but by definition, it's not porn. So what is your definition of porn as a librarian, and what's the line that you allow into your library?
Sure, and it's not my definition of porn. There's an actual legal definition of pornography. And this is the thing, we're always going to grapple with it. People always quote, it when you see it.
Yeah, that's not quite right, because people, if you've been closeted, and sheltered in a bubble your whole life, and you see a nude on a library wall, maybe that would get you going. I don't know.
Cultures where a woman's ankle is considered risque, right? I mean, it is obviously highly dependent, and actually, the Miller test, which is what we use to determine whether or not something is pornographic, takes community standards into account. But
the Miller
test. So it's the 3-prong test that our Supreme Court determines, uses to determine whether or not something is pornographic. But the top line for pornography is it has to be pervasively vulgar. And that word pervasive matters. A drop of rain does not make a thunderstorm. For something to be pervasively vulgar, it has to be meant to excite or to titillate in some way. Like the purpose of it is to make it appeals to the purpose.
Yeah, when you know what it's pretty obvious when. Not saying I do, but when I was a kid, Hustler magazine would go around.
Right.
You'd read those stories. What the intention is, it's pretty obvious. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's also what's called the SLAPS standard, and that's within the Miller test. But does this work have serious literary, artistic, political, scientific merit. I might have missed a letter in that acronym, but it's determining, does this work have value? To your point about the art that depicts nudes, of course it has value. It's art that persists through generations. I'm thinking of Maurice Sendak. He wrote Where the Wild Things Are is what everyone knows, but he also read In the Night Kitchen, which is a beautiful, award-winning picture book where there's a small child and he doesn't have any clothes on. But it's not, if you are excited by that says more about you than about In the Night Kitchen. And I think that we need to keep in mind, like, what our Supreme Court has determined. The Supreme Court has also determined, by the way, that students don't check their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. They do have a right to read. Some people say they don't, but they do.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't have to protect our kids. Of course, we need to protect them from works that are pervasively vulgar, as the Supreme Court determined. But they have a right to access information. And when one parent says, none of you can have To Kill a Mockingbird, they don't get to make that decision for everybody else.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely wrong. And I think the literary traditions of the United States, especially cross-racial barriers, there's things that are obviously that were written back at the turn of, in the 19th century that are not okay today. And to just understand, we view our world through a different cultural, religious lens today than we did back then. And to ban a book like Tom Sawyer, is it Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah, they made the N-word in it.
Yeah, and so to know, okay, back then that was a norm, that was okay, but today that's not okay. And to know that we look at everything in the world today through a different lens than they did, that's actually teaching a really effective lesson.
And you hit on such an important point, because that word is not okay, but that doesn't mean that book should be banned, right?
Yeah.
We talk about it. We say, this is the way people talk back then. Sometimes it's shocking to us today. That I would say that's a reflection of moral progress as a society. And I also love that point, because from a librarian perspective, this is not a partisan issue. It sort of has become politicized and partisan, but there are books that the political left don't really love. Sometimes people want to see.
So who decided Dr. Seuss would be banned? Great, I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around that. So
that's a little different, but yeah, we can talk about
that. Was more of a like, oh, this guy was not good. He had some bad depictions of people who were dark skinned, so he's a bad person. So that work is bad. How did that one come about?
Sure, and to be very clear, that wasn't censorship because it was the publisher and the estate that decided not to publish those books anymore. So that's not really. Libraries are different, right? Because we are publicly funded, and we are held to a different standard for censorship than a private company that can choose whatever.
So it was actually the publisher. I guess each book has a different story and why it's so-called banned.
Yeah. It does still relate to libraries in the sense, well, then we might make the decision, do we still want to have these books that are racially insensitive, that might make our, patrons feel all kinds of ways justifiably when they come across them. And I think these are the tough decisions that librarians as collection developers have to make, right? Because especially in libraries, we have very limited budgets. So when we're weighing the value of any particular book for our community, if a book still has high demand, like, Little House on the Prairie is a great example, there's still a demand for those books, even though there is certainly some racially insensitive language in those books. The line that comes to my mind is one where it says, there are no people who live here, only Indians. Imagine being a Native kid and coming across that sentence. How would that make you feel? Now, we hope that parents are talking to their kids about these books and talking about, the context of them. And there's other really valuable things in those books. You learn about prairie life.
I read those books when I was 7-8 years old, and I loved them. And it's like, how you get a kid, those hooks out there that are going to get a kid interested in reading, I think is the bigger issue too. Like you said, they need to get off the phone, because I think it's like what I see happening as a culture is we are getting so much visual input, which is emotionally charged, that it's kind of shutting off the logical parts of our brain, the more analytical parts. And I don't think that's conducive to creating a better society. I just think people need to turn off screens and get kids and more people in front of words. I mean, that's why we print this magazine every month. We hope that people want to pick up something that's printed on a page. And so what do you think that we could do, or librarians or public officials, to get that message out more?
Sure. I mean, I love that you're bringing that up, because one of the reasons, even as a parent, I mean, I'm actually kind of strict about screens and different influences. I actually grew up in a very conservative home, and I feel like I maybe am bringing that forward. I want to give my kids like a wholesome childhood, but I'm really not a micromanager when it comes to what they read, because I genuinely believe every book they read moves them up the rungs of literacy, and that's really important. And if they find a book they love that I'm like, well, that book's not that great. I mean, I don't really love Captain Underpants. I think they're kind of boring, but kids love them. And if it's getting them reading and in stories, like, reading is work. You take 26 letters and you take these handful of punctuation marks. I'm kind of quoting Neil Gaiman here, but like, and then you build those stories in your head. Like, you create these worlds and you're looking out through the eyes of those characters. And that teaches so many important things. I mean, literacy for sure, which is that is how you learn everything else, is by learning how to read, but critical thinking and empathy and imagination and creativity. And so do I care if some of those books have some language that I really wouldn't want my kids using? No, because there's so much value there.
Sure.
And so I appreciate your point about the written word and getting kids off screens and on things like Utah Stories. But I think what we do is we give them books they love. We give them books that we don't judge the fact that kids might like some tired story. Or, I mean, I read 23 Dragon Masters, and I felt like everyone was the same story with a different dragon. No offense to the author. My kids love them, but, it felt a little hackneyed to me. But if kids are going to get engrossed in reading, I think we need to remove barriers whenever possible.
Yeah, well said. Well, I think that about covers it. Thanks so much for coming on, Rebekah. So tell people how they could get involved in your campaign and understand what your platform is different. It's probably the hardest thing to get out in Utah. How's your platform different than? No. Are there going to be debates? Are there going to be, how are they running this gubernatorial campaign now?
Sure. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about that. I could talk about book banning all the time. And I think if you want to learn more about that, going to letutahread.com is a great place to go to learn more about what's actually happening in Utah and learning more about how you can speak up, preferably at a local level, speaking up at your school or your public school board meetings or at the legislature when they're trying to pass bills that the vast majority of people would not agree with. As for our campaign, this has been so exciting. I mean, this is completely new for me. I have not ever run for office before. I've worked on the advocacy side for libraries for the past 7 or 8 years. But when Brian King asked me to run, I was just delighted to get in the mix and try to have a say on a lot of things I care about. Obviously, not just books. I care so deeply about public education. It's been really frustrating to see over these past few years. I mean, some things have been great, right? We've seen teacher pay increase. I love that. But then we're seeing, these vouchers that are draining $82 million off of our public education system. We see a constitutional amendment on the ballot this November that takes the mandate off of our income tax to go towards public education and people, disability services and other worthy causes. And that's deeply concerning for me. I mean, I think most people know why we have that mandate, because we care about public education. We don't want to see that money go into a general slush fund that can be used for pet projects or whatever the legislature cares about that year. We need to invest in our kids for the long-term sustainability and health of Utah. So having the ability to talk about those things, I'm concerned about the Great Salt Lake. I'm concerned about our air quality here. If we don't get enough water to that lake, no one is going to want to live here. And we
that's huge.
2 wet winters to keep us moving forward. We need to plan for that. And I think Brian King is just right on with so many issues I care about, including, making sure that we don't have government overreach. I'm deeply concerned about the 6-week abortion ban here in Utah. If that law ends up going into law, there's an injunction on it right now, but that really takes away our ability to plan for our own families or to address medical problems when they.
I don't actually know what's the 6-week abortion ban. The first 6 weeks of pregnancy, you're banned from getting an abortion.
So right now in Utah, abortion is legal up to 18 weeks. But we had what's called a trigger law on the books here in Utah that if Roe v. Wade was overturned, which it was, that our law in Utah would be a 6-week abortion ban. We're already seeing the effects of that. We had 1,000 fewer medical residents apply to come and work in Utah. And we're seeing that across the country, states that have draconian, really strict abortion bans. Doctors don't want to come here because they can't practice medicine in the way that they know, that they know they need to. For example, if a woman had an ectopic pregnancy, they have to wait in Texas right now for her to start bleeding out because there's a life of the mother clause in their abortion bans. So in Utah, the Supreme Court did uphold an injunction on that while it's kind of working its way through the courts and figuring out whether it's constitutional. But if at any point, the law is able to go into effect, there will be no abortions in Utah.
Oh, okay. So it's not in effect now.
No.
But if it okay.
It's in the courts right now.
Yeah, that would be a big deal, I would think, if that were enacted.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I encourage people to check out your campaign because I'm more libertarian. I'm a little more conservative. Everybody's got their own biases, but I strongly believe Utah and anybody who's more independent minded should look at what the other side is saying, should look what Democrats are saying, because they tend to, both sides are doing this right now. They tend to misrepresent your views and discredit your views and try to make it black and white. And I encourage people to look at the gray and understand the issues before they say, oh no, I'm all conservative, just straight up Republican right down the road.
Right, which as the church said, voting straight ticket is a quote unquote threat to democracy. You need to look at the character of your respective candidates. I mean, Brian has been a legislator here in Utah 16 years. To try to paint him as this, crazy, wild-eyed liberal it's truly laughable. I mean, Brian has passed so many bills in the legislature, none of which would have passed without the support of Republicans. That's just the way it works. He's common sense and practical and pragmatic. And I think what the top line of our campaign is if you think Utah has gone too far to the right, if you are tired of these bills that don't represent the will of the people, a Democratic governor is a check on a legislature that has amassed too much control. Governor Cox has not stood up to them the way I think that, we would want to see when they pass things such as the book ban bill that as an attorney, he knows is unconstitutional, but doesn't say a word about it. We saw a glimpse of that when he first came into office and used his veto pen that first year, and we haven't really seen it since. And I think for me and Brian, that's concerning because we have three branches of government for a reason, for checks on each other. And I think that if you want to see more balance and moderation in Utah politics, it'd be great if we had a check on a legislature that has right now supermajority control.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Scott Matheson was one of our best governors ever, and he's a Democrat. And I think a lot of conservatives would agree with that.
Agreed.
So it's like, I hope that people, think outside the box that they're stuck in. A lot of people feel like they need to stay in the box or they're, a heretic or whatever. Religion seems to have turned into politics, or politics seems to have turned into religion these days. So yeah. So how can people check out your campaign platform? What website can they go to?
So the website they can go to is kingforutah.com, and you can learn about Brian. You can learn about me. We have a policy page if you want to see where we stand on different issues. But that would be a great place to start. And then, of course, following us on social media. I think I'm Rebekah for LG on most of them.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Rebekah. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for watching Utah Stories. So if you'd like to be a bigger part of our content and be part of what we do, you can subscribe to Utah Stories for $3 a month, or you can subscribe to our digital newsletter at utahstories.com for absolutely free. And now we have a brand new exclusive member paywall. Probably your favorite thing to hear. We had to set up a paywall. We do a lot of high-value content. It's always been absolutely free. We loved it being free. Why do we have a paywall? Because we need to pay our writers more, and we want to do more investigative journalism work. We find that this investigative journalism, especially what we're doing on the homeless situation in Utah, is really building our brand. It's building our presence, especially on social media. I'm not a big fan of social media, but I love the comments we get. So we want to do more of that. So by supporting our paywall, $5 a month, you are going to get all access to our website and our special content, including our documentary films. And another product we are about to launch is Faces of Utah magazine. I'm so proud how this is coming together. It's a magazine that supports the decentralization of our economy. So what do I mean by that? I believe that Strong economies are not made up of giant corporations like nothing but Walmarts and McDonald's and Starbucks, as far as the eye can see. It's made up of ma and pa businesses that have grown successfully and done incredible things. And so in this magazine, we profiled the very best of the best industries where people have done that. I'm so proud of a lot of these people we work with, like my buddy Brandon from Camper Paradise. He and his dad initially have built up this incredible business building affordable housing in Airstream trailers and vans. And folks at Basalt, we basically put in here all the people we hope to have, but we got an awesome feature story about Kyle Whittingham, whether or not it's his last year at the U. We're very excited about that. Our buddies at Cafe Molise at Rhodesia Grill. But these businesses that have basically been around for, decades, we want you to be in here. We really want to tell your story in this book because I think more people need to know why we need to decentralize our economies, why we should support local. It's just such a better idea than just going to big box, shopping at Amazon all the time. I know it's easy to shop at Amazon and it's easy to buy like Budweiser beer, but the guys at Squatter and Wasatch are so far superior. They make such a far superior product than all the crap, macro brewery beer you buy. Salt's Plastic Surgery is this amazing success story. This lady built up Rancho Markets. Ellie Maringal, and she's an amazing entrepreneur, and Rancho's such an incredible place to shop. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all of them, but this is going to be an incredible book, and we'll send it to your house if you become a member and stick with us for at least, 3 payments, and then it'll cover the cost of the magazine. Our goal is to get this up to $200,000 in ads and reader support. If we do, we can make this book super thick with all the best of local Utah. And we want to add this new section called Places, where we feature the very best places to go in Ogden and Moab and Salt Lake City. And that section we're trying to build out right now. If we can get it done, this will be by far the best magazine in Utah. So I'm asking for your support with that by becoming a member. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.